Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Class will come to order, please. I hate being strict with you, but if you have a cell phone, please turn it off or silence it in some manner at this time. Thank you. Just a few announcements. Tomorrow, the library will close at 5 p.m. That's Wednesday. We will be closed for all day on Thanksgiving Day, in case you didn't know that. I was asked to announce that. We will reopen on Friday at regular hours. Okay. Next week, we will continue our observation of Native American Heritage Month with Extinction and the Human, 4 American Encounters, Timothy Sweet from WVU. And so we'll talk about various animal extinctions and the possibility of human extinction. I'm going to now, since it is, and we did get our friend back up on the wall, he has a habit of following many years now. We used to have, I don't know, 8 of them there, and they all stayed mostly except for him. He does not want to be on that wall. But he's up there with alien tape. Let's see how it goes. In recognition of that, I'm going to read our latest version of the land acknowledgement we wrote for Wheeling. The city of Wheeling is situated upon ancestral traditional territories of the Osage, Ohio Valley, Haudenosaunee, which is Iroquois, sometimes referred to as Mingo, as he is by the artist, Delaware, Lenape, Shawnee, and Wyandot peoples, and perhaps others. We know the place name Wheeling is derived from Wheelunk in the Lenape language, meaning skull place, which refers to a European's head being placed on a stake at the mouth of Wheeling Creek as a warning that was not heeded. Today, though, Wheeling, due to removal, is no longer home to a large number of indigenous peoples. We recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can honor those who lived here long before us, to better understand our role as caretakers and storytellers, and to acknowledge our participation to whatever degree in the ongoing colonial process. So, as I said, we are dedicating this and next week's program to National Native American Heritage Month. Our guest today is Timothy G. Anderson. He's a historical geographer at Ohio University with research interests in 3 main areas: historical settlement geography of the United States, the historical settlement geography of Ohio during the early national period, and the production of cultural landscapes associated with Germanic diasporas, especially in North America and Europe. Please welcome Timothy Anderson.
A little shorter, so do that. Well, thank you everyone for coming out on such a gloomy, rainy, cool day. But I'm happy to be here, and I give quite a few of these talks, even outside of the book project that this stems from. I've used to be on the Ohio History Connections Speakers Bureau, and I went to all corners of Ohio and giving talks. So I really love getting out as a geographer. I'm really interested in travel, so I love coming to meet local folks like you all, because a lot of my research deals with looking at migrations of populations, mainly from the east, from Europe and the East Coast into Ohio, but also other parts of the middle part of the United States. So I'm interested in this idea of regionality as well. So Wheeling is a really interesting place because where is Wheeling, right? Is it in the South? Is it in the Midwest? Is it, where is it? Probably if you asked any 2 different people, they'd tell you 2 different things. So what I'd like to talk about today stems from this book that my colleague in the Department of History at Ohio University and I recently published with the Ohio University Press. And it stems from the idea that, well, let me ask you this first. Has anyone read David McCullough's book, The Pioneers? Or is that? Yeah, so that was mainly about the founding of Marietta, Ohio, and this early attempt at establishing a New England in the wilderness, right? The Ohio Company and Ohio University, right, was founded as a result of that incursion by New Englanders. But it turns out that New Englanders really were not that many in numbers over time. And that book, written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, is really phenomenal, but it really tells only one part of that story, right? And so that's where Brian and I got to talking over coffee one day, and we were attending the Midwestern History Association meeting up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, 3 years ago, and we got to thinking about this, that really there are lots of other stories, including Native Americans, African Americans, all sorts of other groups, right, that settled in the New Northwest, in the Old Northwest Territory. So that was the impetus behind this book. So I want to talk about, I wrote one of the chapters in this book, and I want to talk about that. And it really is Ohio-centric, but really it can be about any place. It could be about Wheeling. It could be about the early settlement of almost any place. And in my research, I'm trying to develop kind of a national model for looking at the settlement of specific regions and for understanding that through looking at genealogical data. And so I'm going to talk about two terms that will kind of come up again and again today. One is this idea of selective migration. What I mean by selective migration is the tendency for certain types of people to migrate. That is, I don't know about you all, but I grew up in my high school, my education, thinking about the westwards or the settlement of the United States as this ever westward moving wave of migrants, right? Coming from the East Coast and from Europe, moving across the continent, displacing Native Americans, and just kind of this wave that went eventually all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And what a lot of research by geographers and historians alike has shown is that actually this westward migration happened in fits and starts. There were many frontiers. There wasn't just one frontier. And at that frontier, at those frontier regions that moved west, were these interactions between different peoples, including Native Americans early on, but then interactions among all these different groups that were moving into the western parts of the United States, beginning with, well, really about right here, right, where we're standing today, as people began moving west of the Ohio River. So that's one thing, one aspect of the selective migration. The other is that not everyone migrated, right? Not everyone moved. Most people stayed where they were, actually. But certain types of people moved. In my own research on German immigration, I've found this, that 7 million Germans immigrated to the United States between about 1820 and 1921. But most Germans did not become immigrants. Most stayed at home. So why did some people leave and not others? And that's what I mean by selective migration. That is, this migration impetus selected out certain types of people based on their age, their education level, their socio-demographic characteristics, whether they knew family in certain places or not. That might have influenced them to go to a certain place. And that's where this idea of genealogical geography comes in, by using family histories to analyze and reconstruct previous movements over time and space. And it starts with this assumption, this kind of statement that individuals are tied together in time and space through their biological connections. And that those family ties can be a factor in migration selectivity. That is why someone may choose to migrate, say, from Pennsylvania, Southeast Pennsylvania, or Virginia, or whatever, to another place and to a specific place. I'm making the argument that it more often has to do with kinship ties. That is a big factor in why certain people move from one place to another place. So I've come up with this kind of North American, what I call a North American model of looking at intergenerational life paths over time and space. And I've adapted that from an author named Sam Uderstrom, who's a historical geographer at Brigham Young University. He's a member of the LDS Church, and as such, he has special access to genealogical data that not everyone has. A lot of the LDS genealogical data is available publicly on familysearch.org, and that's been picked up also through other organizations like ancestry.com, etc. But the idea is this: the way to read this is so time is on. Read it from right to left, and this is this model that I've been working with over the past decade or so, trying to kind of think about this. And so time is on the bottom axis, and space is on the y-axis there. And this idea of a root place, what if that can be any town. That could be Wheeling, right? So if we assume Wheeling is this kind of root place as a place where there was a gathering of populations going back over time and space, maybe back to the old world, right? Over generations, then there are these gathering places that occur. Wheeling is a really good example of that, right? Usually these were larger towns, and Wheeling became a kind of jumping off point then for diasporas after this gathering by subsequent generations. So I think you could do this for almost any place, any town, especially larger sized towns, right? So that root place isn't a specific place, it's almost any place. So let me be kind of Ohio-centric, but again, I think you could do this for about any place, and talk about Ohio as this place where many different groups, beginning with indigenous Americans, called home, and that it was a place where a lot of different groups came together after the colonial period. In fact, I would make the argument that Ohio became the one of the earliest places where many different population groups in the colonial era kind of came together again. During the colonial period, we tend to think about, well, New England, there's Virginia, there's, Georgia and the Carolinas, Southeast Pennsylvania. Yes, these were all populations that had kind of Anglo majorities, Anglo-European, British majorities, but they couldn't have been different, right? Who were the New Englanders? They were Puritans, right? These were very different people than in southeastern Ohio, Southeast Pennsylvania. Those folks were Quakers and Pennsylvania Germans, right? The Pennsylvania Dutch. They did not get along very well, and they never did. And they really didn't interact with each other very much during the colonial period. But after the Treaty of Paris, which still created the new United States in 1783, there was a subsequent Western migration, and a lot of those people began to come into Ohio, and Ohio was kind of this funnel. In fact, Wheeling was really one of those places. It was a funneling place where these populations kind of came, and then there was a further diaspora right further west. So between 1790 and 1850, which I think is one of the most interesting eras in U.S. history, because this is right after the Revolution. This was a period when Americans were trying to kind of find themselves as a people, as an e pluribus unum, right? As a one out of many. But that one had to be kind of constructed, right? It had to be identified. And so during this period, the landscapes of the United States began to look a lot different than they did back east, right? So for example, rather than naming towns, new towns after towns found in Europe. So for example, in New England, if you look at the toponyms, the place names of New England, almost all of them are English in origin. Boston, Somerset, Litchfield, right? These are all, right? But in a place like Ohio, a place like upstate New York and Western New York, Americans began to name new towns not based on British norms, but, well, classical place names, right? So names that harken back to ancient Greece and Rome. So look at a map of upstate New York, Western New York. Syracuse, Rome, Attica, Ithaca, Athens. There's an Athens in every state, right? And several of those Athens are actually university towns. Athens, Georgia, Athens, West Virginia, right? Concord College, Athens, Ohio, Ohio University. I could go on and on. So that's what I mean by kind of rethinking, right? And so Americans began to adopt, right, this idea of what are we? We are the new Greece and Rome, right? The new center of democracy, liberty, freedom, right? These big words that we use and throw around. So that's just one example. Another example would be the use of classical architecture, neoclassical architecture in public buildings, right? So libraries, not this one, this was built in the 60s, but a lot of libraries built in the 19th century. State capitals, right? Washington, D.C., right, is a living legacy to ancient Greece and Rome. Every public building there is a legacy to ancient Greece and Rome, right? So so this is going on in the interior. And so these population groups that were kind of separated, literally and figuratively, in the colonial period begin to come together again. And now they are this new thing, Americans, right, that has to be kind of defined. And Ohio was really, and I think actually Wheeling, right? It's the beginning of this. And then it gets, the Midwest is the center of this. So if you look at the 1850 census, which was the first census to ask everyone enumerated, where were you born? At least at the state level. In 1870, the census began asking, where were you born? Where were your parents born? Right, so this is a good, rich source of data. So at least at the state level, we can identify where people had been born. So if you look at Ohio, at the county level and at the township level, it's clear that the early population of Ohio was made up of three different major groups. One would be so-called Anglo-Americans, right? So these would be people mainly of British ancestry, mainly from three of the primary East Coast colonial settlement regions. One was New England, and that was mainly Connecticut. The Mid-Atlantic, mainly Pennsylvania, Southeast Pennsylvania, and the South. And by the South, I mean the first South, Virginia, right? Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy, was Richmond, after all. So the first South, Virginia, and to some extent, Kentucky. A second group that shows up in the 1850 census is African Americans, and members of what I call multi-ethnic groups, mainly from the upland South, Virginia and Kentucky, and what's now West Virginia, settled in mainly southern Ohio, as we'll see. What I mean by multi-ethnic is multicultural. That's people of combined racial and ethnic backgrounds, right? And I'll talk about that. A third group that shows up in the 1850 census was foreign immigrants, people who had been born outside of the United States. And as it turns out, in Ohio and in other parts of the Midwest, this was mainly from German-speaking Europe. And I say German-speaking Europe because there was no such thing as Germany, right? Germany was only established in 1871, 72. So from places like what's now Germany, the Upper Rhine Valley of Switzerland, places like that. So if you look at these numbers, this is Ohio nativity, so place of birth, in 1850. So what's astounding is in 1850 already there are, if you look at the bottom, almost 2 million people in Ohio in 1850. This is astounding because in 1790, 50 years earlier, 60 years earlier, there couldn't have been 10,000 people in what's now Ohio. There couldn't have been. Probably less than that. Now there are 2 million. So this shows you this migration, these migration streams that are coming into the state. So about 66% of the population of Ohio in 1850 had already been born in Ohio. Of those not born in Ohio, here you see these 3 major groups. Anglo-Americans from Pennsylvania, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Connecticut mainly. A so-called black population. This is what, now that black population shows up in different, the census. Sometimes you'll see black, sometimes you'll see an M for mulatto. And that's probably an undercount. There were probably more than that, but that's an undercount. And then foreign immigrants. So here's the foreign-born, origin of foreign-born in 1850 in Ohio. About half of all immigrants came from German-speaking Europe, and then then Ireland was second, and then a smattering of others. So here's a map of the new United States in 1783, right? So we have the 13 original colonies, and then this area in between, in green on this map, is basically the territory that was won by the new United States in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. That is, Great Britain ceded all of this territory basically in between the Appalachians, the Blue Ridge, and the Mississippi River. But, so the new federal government of the United States had to deal with quite a few issues, right? What are we going to do with this land, one? And what are we going to do with the people that are living there? Because there are already people here, hundreds of different indigenous population groups that claim different parts of that territory as their ethnic homelands, right? You also had claims by different eastern states to that territory based on royal charters that sometimes went back to the 17th century. So, for example, if you see on this map here, Massachusetts and Connecticut and Virginia all claimed territory in this new area. So Virginia is outlined in red. So Virginia claimed all of that territory all the way up into what's now Canada, right? Northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, based upon what's called prior appropriation, right? The Virginia colonial government had been sending out people into the Northwest Territory, north and west of the Ohio River for a long time. Probably the most famous of these explorers was Christopher Gist. You may have heard his name before. He came through Wheeling, actually, on one of his exploratory missions. And he was charged by Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia of kind of seeing what's out here. And he came back. He actually hired a young surveyor named George Washington on one of his trips. And they came back with glowing reports of the soils and the forests and the natural environment of this area north and west of the Ohio River. So Virginia had been very interested in this. But look at Massachusetts and Connecticut. The western border legally of Massachusetts and Connecticut was the Pacific Ocean, according to these royal charters, which created the colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts. So the federal government had to deal with this, right? Had to deal with these problems. And some of the first two Congresses spent a lot of their time dealing with these issues. What are we going to do with this territory? Well, one of the things you can imagine that the new federal government saw about this territory, saw the good in this territory, is that it was worth money, right? Because Europeans commodified land, right? This is a basic fact from the very beginning, is that land in the European system, European worldview was something that could be bought and sold, right? Which was something totally foreign to most indigenous groups. And that was a source of conflict from the very beginning. This is the image that we chose for our book, Settled in Ohio. And I love it. I got to choose I was tasked with choosing the image by Ohio University Press. And some years ago, I was in Chicago, and I saw this painting. It's hanging in the Chicago History Museum in downtown Chicago. And what it depicts is, it actually doesn't have a title. And we don't even know who the artist was. But the title usually goes something like preparations for or negotiations for the Treaty of Greenville, which was signed in 1795, and those were negotiations between the federal government and these various indigenous populations living in what's now the Northwest Territory over this issue, right? So you had these hundreds of different tribes, dozens in what's now Ohio, and they engaged in negotiations with the federal government, represented by General Anthony Wayne, so-called Mad Anthony Wayne. You may have heard of him before. But I love this. So he's there in front, and he's talking with Little Turtle, the Miami chief, and his translator is William Wells. There have been a new book actually just came out all about William Wells. He was a really interesting guy because he was the son-in-law of Tecumseh, right? So he knew Shawnee. He also knew Miami. And so you can see him there kneeling. He's writing down, right? He's translating this. So I love this painting because it shows this interaction, right? That from the very beginning, indigenous populations were not just people who laid over and gave up and just moved to Oklahoma, right? This was an ongoing process with negotiations going back and forth. You also see one of Anthony Wayne's lieutenants is William Henry Harrison, the future president, although he was only president for 30 days because he got sick and died. And then some other, the Wyandotte chief, Tare the Crane, and there were others. There were several others there as well, but the artist did not include them. Here's the more famous painting, the Treaty of Greenville. There's Tecumseh, they're the Shawnee chief on the left, and Mad Anthony Wayne on the right, and they are ceding this territory. So this kind of coalition of tribes, the Wyandottes, the Shawnee, the Miami, especially, those three are ceding basically what is the northwestern 2/3 of what is now Ohio to the federal government in exchange for land further west. And in the end, that turned out to be way far west. That turned out to be places like Kansas and Oklahoma. So here's a map showing kind of the outcome of this interaction with indigenous populations and interaction of Congress, the federal government, dealing with these claims to land by different states, like Connecticut, like Virginia, especially, in the Northwest Territory. So to make a very, very long story short, after very complex and sometimes contentious negotiations, the federal government signed a treaty, which you can see there, right there, that line, the Treaty of Greenville, that ceded everything north and west to the federal government from Native Americans. And you can see a couple of other places here too, the so-called Virginia Military District and the Connecticut Western Reserve. So these were places that were reserved by both Connecticut and Virginia for, so Connecticut said, okay, we'll cede all this territory to the Pacific Ocean. Virginia said the same thing, we'll cede all this land, but we want to reserve a piece of land in the Ohio country. We want to reserve that to repatriate our Revolutionary War veterans. We can't pay them, but we can. Land is money, right? In an agricultural society, land is money, so we'll give them land instead, right? So that's what the Western Reserve was and the Virginia Military District were. And the federal government also reserved a piece of territory here called the U.S. Military District. No other state in the country has a map like this. Well, Texas kind of does. Texas always has to be first. But other than Texas, there is no other state in the country that has a map like this. And that is a result of these negotiations. So what I've done here is I've mapped out the township level. That's what all those little units are, not counties. The counties are the thicker lines. But these are civil townships. And what I did here is I'd simply looked at the 1850 census and looked at, okay, where of the non-Ohio born population, where were the majority, 50.1% or more of that early population born. And you can clearly see, right, compare that map. Where did people from Connecticut settle when they went to Ohio? Overwhelmingly up here, right? And look at that line, right? Shows right up, right? Where did Virginians go? Mainly to the Virginia Military District. Pennsylvanians went about everywhere else. And then foreign-born were in certain places like this area. These are mainly Old Order Mennonites and Amish, many of whom had been born in what's now Switzerland, come to Pennsylvania and then moved over here. And then these are German immigrants over here as well. Okay, so what this did with Ohio is this created these regional cultural landscapes, right? If you go to this part of Ohio, it feels like, it looks like, it tastes like the South. It tastes like, and looks like West Virginia, right? This is where I live. I can tell you the vast majority of the population outside of the university, where do they look figuratively for their identity? Not to Columbus, they look this way, right? These folks here might as well be West Virginians, right? Most of their family ancestry was from here, etc. West Virginia hot dogs, to find them, that's the part of Ohio to go to, right? Et cetera, right? You go to up here, totally different. It's Ohio, it's America, right? But it looks like and feels like and tastes like New England. The town names, et cetera, right? And if you go to this part, most of this other part of Ohio, it's Pennsylvanians, right? It's the mid-Atlantic. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by this. So when I say upland, the upland South, when geographers say the upland South, they mean mainly Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, right? Not the lower South, the old Cotton South, but the upland South. And so, and the heart of the upland South was originally Virginia, and including West Virginia, right? Which was not West Virginia in 1863. So, what I've been doing is using genealogical data at the family level to track these migrations. And remember that model I showed you, right? Of like a root place, right? These gatherings and then diasporas. I think what shows up in these family migrations is that. That's what I've developed that model from. Why I've chosen certain families is just it's kind of at random, right? I chose certain families, for example, that show up in the history and kind of early important families in the Chillicothe area here in the middle side of the valley. These are names that like everyone knows there, right? These are like kind of founding fathers, so to speak, the founding families. But really, you could do this for any family. Any of you could do this with your family, right? and thinking about it not only in time, but thinking as a geographer, thinking about it in space as well, from place to place. So that's what I mean by, so really what I chart out here are the life paths of members of these different families. So in this case, I'm looking at people who settled very early on, like 1801, for example. So let me say it's really early. Folks are in here in this part of the pie. Where are they coming from? Well, you can see. Mainly, they're starting out in southeastern Pennsylvania, and then they're and then going back, to Europe, and then they're gathering kind of in this place right here. That is Hardy County, West Virginia. That's the south branch of the Potomac Valley. So all of these families, these four families, gather here beginning around the 1730s and 1740s. This becomes a major area of settlement west of the Blue Ridge, right, which is basically right here. Right, so this is an area settled on Moorfield, and what I in red here are the ancestral homes of these families, these four families, and a really interesting place, a really interesting group of people. Most of them had Scots-Irish ancestry. One, the Van Meter family, had obviously Dutch ancestry. The Van Meters had come from the Hudson Valley, which was settled mostly early on by Dutch families, moved down to New Jersey, and then wound up here. And these folks were big-time cattle, right? In fact, I make the argument that the Middle Western, what's called stopper feeding system of growing a lot of corn and then feeding that corn not to people but to cows, and then herding them back east to East Coast population centers. That developed here, right? A very distinctive type of agricultural system. So you grow a bunch of corn down here in the valley, right? And in the winter, the summer months, you let your cattle kind of roam up here on the uplands. And in the winter, you bring them down and put them in pens. There are a lot of place names in the Carolina Piedmont where a similar type of system emerged called cowpen. You heard the Battle of the Cowpens in the Civil War? That's what a cowpen was. It was a place where you're gathering your cattle, and then you stuff them full of corn, fatten them up, and then you move them overland to where the markets are. Not here in the 18th century, they were back east, Boston, Baltimore, New York, etc. So that system gets transferred to the Scioto Valley by these families in Ohio. And I think it's the Scioto Valley where this really gets solidified. And this sort of, the Corn Belt, I would argue, began there. But really it began in Hardy County. Has anyone been to Hardy County? Yeah, fantastic place. Isn't this gorgeous? Really interesting. What they also brought with them were these upland south techniques. For example, log construction with different types of folk notching techniques, right? There's lots of ways to put together a log cabin or a barn, right? Not just Lincoln logs, but like distinctive notching techniques, right? And geographers and historians look at those techniques and kind of to think about where they came from. Here I've mapped out this area. So this is just south of Columbus, and this area was all settled by Virginians, at least the earliest populations. And they erected and created a landscape that looks very southern. You all would feel very at home here, right? As West Virginians, as Virginians, you feel very, very well. And this is just 30 miles south of Columbus. I remember the first time I came to Ohio was when I interviewed for my position at Ohio University. I'd never been to Ohio. I grew up in Oklahoma. I'd never been to Ohio, and I thought Ohio was either corn fields and soybean fields or steel towns, right? So I landed in Columbus, and it felt very Midwestern, right? It felt kind of flat, lots of cornfields and soybeans. I got in my rental car and drove south and east, and by the time I got down to this little town called Lancaster, within about 5 miles, the landscape totally changed. And I had gone from the Midwest into Appalachia, full on, right? There's no other place in the country where you can do that, right? There's no other state in the country where these divisions are so sharp. Again, Texas, maybe California, has, because it goes back to the Spanish era. But again, I think Ohio is really even more so. Right, so very distinctive types of housing, right? So this is the Highway Farm, the estate of Garrett Van Meter. So old man Van Meter came to the South Valley with 3 of his sons, and they started this big farm, and the Van Meters are still there, right? So this became kind of a secondary root place for the Van Meter family. The first was Hardy County. Next was South Valley, and then if you were to look at subsequent generations, now they're all over the place. They're in California, they're in Montana, they're right all over the place. Right, there's this further western bias. But here in this place that they made home in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they built a home like they built back in Hardy County. And so if you were a wealthy, well-to-do person at the time, this is the kind of house you built. This is called an I house. And an I house is basically a Georgian house, which is very popular in the colonies and on the East Coast. And it became the most common type of folk house in the United States during this early national period. The forms varied from place to place. This is what southern ones look like. Southern I houses often have a second story porch, right? Whereas Pennsylvanians didn't build with that second story porch. But so this is the original house. This was built on later. So an I house is a house like this, right? So this was the very first house built by the Van Meters when they first got there. So I house, it's 1 room deep and 2 or more rooms wide and 2 stories high. That's basically Georgia. If you go to Scotland or England, these were a dime a dozen, right, all over the place. They look a little different, but I mean the basic form is there. Another aspect of Virginia, the Virginia Military District that comes from Virginia is the way that they laid out land. And so in the Virginia Military District, those Virginians surveyed their land the way that they had been doing for a long, long time. And that's what's known as meets and bounds survey, right? So all of West Virginia is laid out this way, right? What this is, the way you do this is you hire a surveyor to survey out a certain acreage or whatever that you have bought. And the surveyor comes out and uses physical features in the environment like a creek, right? Or a large oak tree with an X marked on it, or a big hunk of granite with an X marked on it. That's what's known as a meet, right? That's what the meets and bounds is. And then those meets were connected by straight lines. And that's what a bound was. And so you come up with these types of land borders. And if you fly over that part of Ohio, this is what it looks like, which is what it looks like flying over almost anywhere east of Ohio, right? What does it look like when you fly over Nebraska at 30,000 feet? Yeah, it's a big checkerboard, right? And that's because the public land survey system, the so-called Township range survey system, was a federal survey system that started, guess where? Ohio, right? And it started just north of here, was where that began. And that's what's known as the 7 ranges. That was the first federal survey system. So everywhere except the original 13 colonies, Hawaii, parts of Texas was a bit different, and that's it. Everywhere else is public land survey system, squares, right? Pennsylvania Germans settled mainly in, Pennsylvania Germans settled mainly in this part of Ohio, right? Most of the central part of Ohio. A lot of these folks were Pennsylvania Germans, not, or so-called Pennsylvania Dutch, right? But Dutch, they weren't Dutch at all, right? They were Deutsch. Right? It's a corruption of the word Deutsch. And they came, so people who settled in this area around Lancaster, which is just 20 miles east of the Saddle Valley, those folks came from a very different part of the country. They came from southeast Pennsylvania, had moved up into central and western Pennsylvania, and then by the early 19th century had made it out to Ohio. This is the place of birth as report of so-called prominent citizens that were recorded in the 1875 history of Fairfield County, Ohio, which is centered on the town of Lancaster, named after Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Right? So you can see where most of these folks came from. That part of the country. Let me just move on to this. So they brought with them a different set of ideals, for example, on how to build things. The most conspicuous aspect of that cultural landscape that the Pennsylvanians brought was the so-called bank barn, or the Pennsylvania bank barn. In West Virginia, the best place to see these is in the eastern Panhandle and that area around like Fredericksburg and up into Maryland, Western Maryland. A lot of Pennsylvania Germans settled there as well. Whenever you see a bank barn, that's really a proxy for Pennsylvania German settlement. It's not an absolute, but if you see a bunch of them, especially, yeah, this was probably Pennsylvania Germans, right? So these were great big large barns, and I've identified in this 5-county area south and east of Columbus, centered on the little town of Lancaster. I've identified about 85 of these barns, and that's the second largest distribution of these types of barns outside of southeast Pennsylvania, where every barn is like this. And those Pennsylvania Germans settled in this area right along and north and west of that glacial divide in Ohio, right? So the southeastern part of Ohio, Appalachian Ohio, was unglaciated during the last glacial epoch. I'm actually standing on top of the glacial moraine, right? So all this stuff, these hills, that's all this, it's not a very scientific way of saying it, but all this stuff that these glaciers, which were a mile thick, right? 12,000 years ago, if I were standing right here, imagine there's a mile-high glacier, right? And out of the end of that glacier, when the climate changed about 12,000 years ago and warmed, those glaciers began to melt back toward the poles, and they dumped out in front of them all of this stuff that they had in them, trees and rocks and soil, and etc. And that's what this is. It's called glacial till. And it left behind fabulously wealthy, wealthy is the wrong word, rich soils, right? Agricultural soils. So these Pennsylvania Germans were farmers. They were commercial farmers, and they needed really good land. So they didn't go to southeast Ohio. So just like West Virginia, how are the soils for agriculture in West Virginia? Any farmer will tell you they're horrible, right? So the same in southeast Ohio, they're horrible. Except maybe in creek bottoms, right, where you have some river alluvial soils. These are the richest soils in the world, right, for agriculture. And so what got established here was large farms where farmers were doing two things. They were growing lots of corn, later on soybeans, and they were livestock farmers for mainly dairy cattle. So the barns they built, unlike barns in the South, which are really only for storing grain and hay, right, to keep it out of the weather. For the Pennsylvania Germans, they needed a big barn because they're not only storing their hay and grain up here, but down here they have their dairy cattle stanchions, right? So where every morning they're bringing their dairy cattle in here to milk. So they needed a barn that did two things, right? So a barn was also a place where livestock lived. And in the Southern tradition in the United States, and this was like in the English tradition, a barn is not a place where animals live. Animals live outside. Right? Not in this tradition, which was probably brought from the Upper Rhine Valley of Switzerland and Germany. So if you look at the distribution of these barns, they're mainly here, right? That's where these Pennsylvania Germans set up shop in the 1720s, 1730s. And then there was this diaspora, right? They moved west as well into places like, right, down into the Shenandoah Valley, and then west into Ohio and even further west, right? And these are the types of barns they built. This was the first thing that was built, not a house, the barn. That was the most important thing, right? Some really interesting things in the landscape in this part of Ohio. This is the Poorman barn, which unfortunately is no longer there. They bulldozed it down, but it was built. So this is on the gable end here. The builder put this thing, 1819, Bernhard Poorman, the space to write his whole name. But look at the symbols here. That part, look at that. That's a sun swirl, right? That's a swastika, right? Which has nothing to do with Nazi Germany, right? Unfortunately, Hitler adopted that symbolism, but that's a symbol that goes back ages and ages, thousands of years, right? Back to ancient Germany, back to ancient, it shows up in India, that symbol, way back in antiquity. And that is just a symbol that what's that? It's a sun. Yeah, it's a sun. Yeah. So the Pennsylvania Germans put these symbols on everything. They put them on their gravestones, on their Bibles, on their birth certificates, and used a lot of color. And that was just the folklore, right? This folk tradition that came from where they came from Europe. This is the Roscoe barn. This is you can't see here, but this is a double pin log, very, very rare. Probably the only one in Ohio, built in the 1820s. The only other place you'll find a log bank barn like this is in Pennsylvania. Those Pennsylvanians built houses as well, right? They didn't build German houses. They built what other Americans were doing, especially if you had some money, wanted to show it off, you build a house like this. So this is an house, but it's a Pennsylvania house. Virginia house would have a second-story porch and pillars, right? I'm sure you've probably seen one or two of those in the landscape around here. I've seen them in Beckley, I've seen them in Lewisburg, but in Pennsylvania, you don't have that. And then they are putting new American kind of ideas on this. This is what's called federal ornamentation. So these decorative door casings and window lintels, right, like that. There's another good example of one. See the eye house. By the way, they're called eye houses because by American architectural historians because they became so popular in Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. Not because they look like a capital I. That's wrong. But anyway, so you see they built on later on. But that's the original house there. Anyone ever been to the Greenbrier? The Greenbrier up on Cottage Row has the best example of a Virginia eye house that exists in the country. Right? If you're ever down there, you don't have to go to the Greenbrier to go. You can just go dark. But yeah, really, really amazing. I wish I do somewhere. I should put it. The Pennsylvania Germans were not Baptist and Presbyterians like the Virginians. They were Lutherans and Evangelical United Brethren, United Church of Christ, German Reform. So all around the cultural landscape of that part of Ohio, it looks like this. Does that look like Virginia? No, that looks like Pennsylvania, right? So these Lutheran churches with an accompanying cemetery, and in those cemeteries you get some really interesting things. Here's a little town called Hallsville. I don't know if you can read it up here, you probably can't. It says Hallsville EUB Church. That's the Evangelical United Brethren, which doesn't exist anymore because in 1964 they merged with the Methodist Church of America to form the United Methodist Church. So Methodism was very, very influential among the Pennsylvania Germans. And if you look at the graveyards there, right, you find some really interesting things. Here's Wilhelm Betze, right, who was born in 1823 and died when he was 80 years old here in Ross County, Ohio. He was born in Bucks County in southeast Pennsylvania. And look at that symbol shows up here, right, on Henry Roller's grave here. Here, in much of this part of Ohio, the Township Range Public Survey System, which was instituted in 1785 by federal legislation, that gets put in place. And a lot of the early towns, so far I've counted about 35 of them in central and eastern Ohio, have this very distinctive layout. This is the little town of Somerset in Perry County, Ohio. And you can see here the public square is taken out of 4 adjoining blocks. And that is what's called a diamond square or a Pennsylvania square. And that comes from Philadelphia. Right, so that's William Penn's 1683 Philadelphia plan, and you can see that. And so today, right, you see that. This is the little town of Somerset, right? And in the middle of that public square was the favorite son there. That's William Sheridan, who's a Civil War general. Very typical. There's Mount Vernon, right? You can see that form again, right? And then finally, New Englanders, try to go faster here. New Englanders are settling mainly up here, right? And if you go to that part of Ohio, it feels very different. It looks very different. Where were those families coming from? Well, not Pennsylvania and not Virginia. They were coming from Connecticut. And so there was this major migration to New Connecticut, right? The Western Reserve of Connecticut, here in the early 1900s, or early 1800s, sorry. The little town of Litchfield in northwest Connecticut figures prominently in the early settlement of the Western Reserve. The town of Talmadge was established by several families from this little town in northwest Connecticut, Litchfield. And Litchfield looks like your typical New England town, right? It's a village green, right? And in the middle of that green is a war veterans monument, and on the side of that is a big United Church of Christ, or a big congregational church, right? So they brought with them different ways of building, right? So if you were really well-to-do, maybe you build what is simply called a large house, this sort of 3-story. It's basically a Georgian house, but it's really big. Or if you were not well-to-do, you build a saltbox house, right? So if you go to lots of little towns in New England, these line the main roads, these saltbox houses, or so-called upright mean, and then the congregational churches. So this is the first congregational church in Ohio in the town of Talmadge. And right here is a congregational church, which is now UCC, United Church of Christ, right? There's no such thing as a congregational church or UCC. And if you go to the cemeteries, you see some interesting things, right? Sometimes you get lucky. You see, here's Emily Coe, who was born in Waterbury, Connecticut, right? Died in Talmadge, Ohio. And then sometimes, this is pretty rare, but you'll see that old New England colonial graveyard style, right? That's a soul effigy, right? That's the soul of the departed flying up to heaven, right? And there's the eye of God, right? The eye of God and the 10 Commandments, right? To meet them when they get up there. In the Western Reserve, the Connecticut Land Company laid out the Connecticut Western Reserve, not in using the federal township range system, but their own system, which was also rectilinear. That the townships there are not 36 square miles like they are everywhere else in the country. They are 25 square miles. And there are lots of these towns, what I call kind of green villages and towns. And that's this New England ideal, right? Sometimes they're kind of oval shaped, sometimes they're a circle, sometimes they're square shaped or rectangular. Most of them in Ohio are kind of oval shaped, right? So here's the Western Reserve laid out in the different townships, 25 square miles. And this is Talmadge, and you see that rectilinear, right? So the roads are north, south, east, west. And what's common also in some of the earliest towns are these diagonal roads. And you see this in New England as well sometimes. And there's Talmadge, right, on the village green, but they still call it the green, right? And this is the little town of Milan, further west. And here's the village green, right? And this is a kind of a rectangle. Yeah. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so I will stop there. I could do the same thing for other populations, right? If you look at, for example, African American populations in southern Ohio, these would be freed people who were manumitted once they got north and west of the Ohio River. A lot of those folks came from Virginia. These are all towns in southern Ohio that were established by freedmen. In Athens County, Ohio, there's one just north and east of town, a little town called Chester Hill. And that town was settled by the Tabler family, who came originally from a plantation in just north and west of Richmond. The youngest son, Michael Tabler of this family, fell in love with one of his father's slaves, and he was kind of blacklisted by the family. So he had a lot of money, but he was not going to inherit the land. So he took his this person that he loved, and they had 2 children, and they came to Wheeling. And when they were here in Wheeling, he purchased her and his children's freedom, and then went west of the Ohio, right, which was established as free territory, right, by the Northwest Ordinance, and looked for some land, and he found some land available in this part of Athens County, right up in here. So this is where Ohio University is, and this is where Chester Hill is. And Chester Hill is this place well, another group came from Barber County, around Philippi, and those folks settled in a place called Blackford in Jackson County, Ohio. And those populations, this is a little town of Kilbert, which used to be called Tabler Town after the Tabler family. This is where Michael Tabler settled with his now wife, Hannah. And so their ancestors live still largely in and around this area of rural Athens County. And they are multi-ethnic. That's what they refer to. They don't call themselves mulatto. That's really an outdated term. They use the term multicultural or multi-ethnic. And in fact, they are not just Anglo-American and African-American. There is Native American in them as well, in terms of their ancestry. So really quite interesting. And you get some really, really interesting types of landscapes in these little towns. And you kind of have to hunt for them, but they're really, really interesting. Yeah, so I'll stop there because we're at our stopping point. But I'd be glad to answer any questions after. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for giving this lecture. It was wonderful. And you mentioned in the book that you wrote a chapter.
Yeah.
You forgot to tell us the number of the chapter.
It's a chapter, I think it's chapter 6. Let me look here. It is, I forgot. It is chapter 5. chapter 5. Yeah. And that basically what I gave here is that chapter. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, my grandfather was Pennsylvania, okay? But ancestry tells us that his ancestors were in England for long period.
Yeah.
1776. They were over in Pennsylvania with slaves. This is 1770.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's possible that they came from Germany, then went to England, then came.
That is certainly possible, especially if they were they Mennonites, or if they were Mennonites, or one of these Anabaptist,
They had been, I think they.
or if they were Quaker. Yeah, they might have. So they might have. Yeah, that would not probably have been all that uncommon, right? A lot of Germans who were in the Upper Rhine Valley, which was mainly an area that was predominantly Catholic. If you were Protestant, that wouldn't have been a fun place to be. And a lot of those folks left. Many of them were Amish and Mennonites. They didn't all go to Holland or England and then the United States. Some of them went to Russia, right, to the southern to the Ukraine and southern Russia. And then a lot of those folks ended up coming in the 1870s and 1880s to Canada, to Western Canada and the Dakotas. But no, this would not have been all that uncommon, I think. Holland and England was a refuge for those Protestant people from the Upper Rhine Valley. Yeah. Oh, yes.
They want to know where you're from, so how that's here.
Conceptual model. Yeah. My family fits that conceptual model perfectly. I think almost every family does. My family came from, one side was Swedish immigrants, that's the Anderson. One side was German immigrants. And they ended up in northwest Oklahoma when that area opened up to white settlement. And that became a root town. And if I were to look at subsequent generations, they're further west. They're in Colorado, they're in Utah, they're in California. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
That's not really important.
Thank you.
But the inhabitants on the Americans, was it the case that they were all displaced, or was there a reservation system in Ohio?
There were no reservations in Ohio. A lot of those populations, the vast majority of indigenous people in Ohio left after the Treaty of Greenville, were either left voluntarily or more often than not were forced out. The Shawnee are a perfect example of that. So the Shawnee capital was Chillicothe. That word Chillicothe means capital, right? The Shawnee, by about the 1830s, were forcibly removed to Oklahoma Territory. And that's where the eastern band of the Shawnee are headquartered right now. That's where most of them live. And there are only about, I think, 500 people left of that. Now that was one band of the Shawnee. I think there must be thousands of people in Ohio who have Shawnee ancestry if they looked deep enough, right? Probably have. But yeah, there were no reservations, right? That Treaty of Greenville that ceded that whole part of Ohio to the federal government, and then they were moved west. Yeah, so the Wyandots, I think the Wyandots, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, they all ended up in Oklahoma. Yeah, because that's what Oklahoma was. Yeah, that the federal government set that territory up for them. But even in Oklahoma, there weren't that many reservations. There's only one reservation in Oklahoma, and that's the Osage Reservation, which is that's the film that just came out, right? About elsewhere in Oklahoma, they're not reservations. It's a very interesting kind of people are just there, right? And they claim, okay, I'm Cherokee, but there's no such thing as a Cherokee reservation. But the vast majority of people of Cherokee ancestry live in Eastern Oklahoma. They have their own tribal government, right? But they don't really, and they have kind of a territory, but it's not. It's very complex and kind of convoluted on how that works. The federal government never really came up with a solution, right? Reservations was unfortunately the only deal on how there's no room in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution is there a way to have a country within the country, right? So the only option was reservations, right? You can't have your own country, but you can have kind of quasi, like the Navajo. If you go to Navajo land in the Four Corners, it feels like you're in a different country almost, right? The Navajo have their own police, their own highway patrol, their own judges, right? Language is prominent. But that's about the only place. You wouldn't see that like in Eastern Oklahoma. A number of people in Eastern Oklahoma who are Cherokee, who speak Cherokee, a few hundred maybe, I would say. Maybe some speak it as a second language. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned many British thinking, like your state and town.
Yeah.
You know about each team. What about the American?
Yeah. Lots of them. Yeah. See, this is actually my master's student is doing his thesis right now on. He's looking at mounds, right? The mounds, the Hopewell, the Adena built. And it turns out a lot of those mounds were never destroyed. In fact, they were oftentimes incorporated into these new landscapes. For example, the biggest cemetery in Marietta, Ohio is called Mound Cemetery. And it has a big, huge Hopewell mound. And what he's trying to understand is why did they do the because supposedly Americans hated the Indians, right? Or saw them as savages, right? That's our imagery, right? Is that really the case? If I was and like these early very strong Christians, right? They are burying their dead on a sacred site of Native Americans. They knew the Native Americans built that, right? So you give that's kind of an interesting question, right? Was that relationship really? I mean, certainly it was violent, but here are some examples of American settlers adopted these former sacred places and made them into their own sacred places. They adopted their place names, right, and didn't rename a lot of places, right? In fact, most of the place names of like the states in the Western United States are indigenous origin, right? Utah, Mississippi, go on and on and on, right? Montana. I have. Yep. Really fascinating. Yeah, so those landscapes are all around, right? These indigenous landscapes are all over the place. The first chapter of the book, and you can get the book on Amazon, by the way, if you want. But the first chapter of the book is written by an archaeologist at Ohio University and named Joe Gingrich, and it's really, really good. And he sums up about 10,000 years of history in about 30 pages, and he does it in a really good job. And he talks about these landscapes that are all over the place, right? In not only Ohio, but this part of West Virginia, and all down the Ohio Mississippi River Valley. If you've never been over to Hopewell National Culture Area, Hopewell National Culture Site at Chillicothe, Ohio, that has just been named to the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Site. Right, that's the latest UNESCO site. It's comprised of two main sites in Ohio: the Newark Earthworks at Newark, Ohio, and the Hopewell site at Chillicothe.
World War I, they used it for,
That's right.
training area for soldiers, and they devastated the place.
They did, yeah.
They moved them all out after the war was over. They put it all back.
Yeah.
Now there's a museum that's awesome.
It's awesome. Yes,
You can see how they're buried, having to do with the star.
It's
makes you
fascinating.
stop and think about how smart these people were.
Yeah, yeah.
50 miles away, there's another one just like it.
Yeah.
Built exactly the same.
And Newark is like that as well. The Newark site,
It's amazing.
which was had become part of a golf course, right? So the mounds, the old mounds there, were hazards in the golf course. And the Eastern Shawnee, the chief of the Eastern Shawnee, a woman named Glenna Wallace, who wrote the epilogue to this book, she's amazing. I think I would dare say that's the best part of this book, is her kind of personal history of, as a Shawnee, going to Oklahoma and then coming back to Ohio and seeing that site at Newark, right? Now, technically speaking, and this can get you in trouble, her ancestors didn't build the earthworks there, right? The Shawnee are not the ancestors of the Hopewell and the Shawnee came in probably from the Iroquois speaking, right? So they probably came in from what's now Quebec, that area of Canada, and came down into Ohio, probably not very long ago, maybe in the 1500s, 1600s. But it doesn't really matter, right? Nevertheless, that area is sacred to her, right? To her people. And she was instrumental in getting that on the UNESCO site. She actually was in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, 4 weeks ago, when that was named as a UNESCO site. Yeah, really fascinating. You're very welcome. Yes.
You guys are very interesting talk.
Thanks.
My